Hi, welcome to Tensisters TV. I'm Carmen Geddes, and today we are going to talk about some finishes to your binding. Specifically, we're going to be putting piping in the edge of the quilt before we bind it. This is a little example. I love putting piping in the edge of the quilt because it gives it a nice little accent of color, and because we're making our own piping with a polyester or nylon cording, it gives that edge of the quilt some really great stability. It's not going to shrink or stretch. So let's get started. So let's get started on our project by actually making our binding. So there's a couple things that you're going to need. The first is a nice nylon cord. I actually buy this at the hardware store, but where you're going to find your rope. And the nylon cording comes in gauges. So we use an 18 or a 16 gauge cord. You want to make sure that it's a nice round cord and not kind of smashed flat. So you're going to get lots of piping out of this. Sometimes in the home deck section you're going to find it too. And I start out with a strip of fabric that's about 1.5 inches wide. And you can cut it across the grain or along the lengthwise grain of the fabric. You can even use some leftover bias binding if you want to. We'll kind of talk about that as we go. So to start out, every sewing machine comes with a zipper foot. So the easiest way to make the piping on our sewing machine is to snap on that zipper foot. Now, zipper feet are going to be different shapes and sizes, but essentially the way that a zipper foot works is you are going to bump the edge of the cording against the side of the foot. And so let me show you a couple little tips. To start out making our piping, I like to take an Elmer's washable glue stick. I'm just putting a little dab of that glue right at the end of my strip to make the piping. And I just lay that cord right there so it holds in place. Just kind of squeeze those together. Give that just a little bit of roll. This is just holding the end of that together. So it's very easy to put all that under the sewing machine. So when you're making that piping, like I said, we're going to butt the edge of the foot up against the cord. You're going to go to your stitch length. I always lengthen that stitch length to about a 3.5. Now the other thing that happens is because we butt the edge of that foot up against the cord, you're going to need to move your needle over to that left-hand position so that the needle is going down just to the right of the cord. So we are going to go ahead and make our piping. So you might need to, if you haven't done this before, you might need to refer to your directions in your owner's manual, and because every sewing machine is going to be a little bit different, but most sewing machines you can adjust the length, and you can also adjust that needle position, which is exactly what you need to make your own piping. So like I said, I really like making my own piping with this cord because it's going to really stabilize the edge of that quilt. And so have you ever made a quilt where you made that quilt top and you know that it's nice and square, it gets quilted, and you go and add your binding to the edge of that quilt, and then for some reason now your quilt edge is a little bit wavy? That's really common because it's really easy to stretch the edge of the quilt, or it's really easy to stretch the binding when you're sewing it on. So I really like having this nice stable piping on the edge of the quilt. Now, when we add binding to the edge of our quilt, typically we're sewing that binding on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if we're adding piping to the edge of our quilt, what we need is piping with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And so we've made our piping using that 1.5 inch strip. There are different piping tools out there. Now a piping tool is like an acrylic ruler, except where the measurement is, there's a little groove at the bottom to accommodate this cord in the piping. And so this one is my Tensisters Piping Tool. The reason that I used this tool, or made this tool, is because I wanted 4 seam allowances. We have a 1/2 inch, a 1/4 inch, a 3/8, and a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So for lots of different sewing uses. So we are going to place that piping tool over the top. We're going to go back and forth to make sure that that cord is inside the groove of the piping tool. Let's start at the bottom here. And you're going to get your rotary cutter, and we're just going to trim off that excess. So we're going to slide that down. Sometimes I'm doing lots of yards of piping. So now what we've got is piping with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now here's our little quilt sandwich. I've already sewn on a couple piping to the edge. Now we're going to just overlap. As we sew the piping on, I just overlap the corners. Instead of trying to go around a corner, we're just going to overlap them. But remember that we made our piping using that zipper foot. But I don't want to sew the piping on the edge of the quilt with the zipper foot, because most of the time it's going to just fall off. A lot of zipper foots are more narrow, and it'll just want to slide off the edge of the quilt. So I changed the foot on my sewing machine. I'm just putting on a regular piecing foot. This one actually happens to have a little, kind of a little groove area underneath, just to accommodate a little bit of bulk. You don't have to have that, but that helps. And so we're going to snap that foot on, or place that foot on your sewing machine. And then we're going to sew the piping on. Now typically I will just leave a little hanging over the edge, and I'm going to keep the stitch length, that longer stitch length, so about a 3.5 stitch length. You don't want to have it be just totally basted. Now I'm actually going to move my needle position back to the middle, because then I'm just going to match the raw edges. I'm going to just match up the raw edge of the piping with the raw edge of the quilt, and I'm going to, that helps me have a center position, kind of helps me, I guess maybe the foot is covering the whole piping. So I guess I have a little bit more support than having that needle turned or needle moved over. The other thing that I do when I'm sewing the piping on the edge of the quilt, I want to have just a whisper of that quilt showing. Not really anything that you can measure. What I don't want is for that piping, let's see if I can get this in here, I don't want the piping to go over the edge of that quilt. I want the piping to keep that full 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if I have just a whisper of that quilt showing as I sew this on, the other thing I want to make sure that I am not stretching this. I want to make sure that it's just nice and flat. We're going to sew that on to the edge of the quilt. Oh, that's nice. Now the other thing that I want you to notice is that, I mean, just so that you can see a little bit easier, but I also made the piping and I sewed it on the quilt with a contrasting thread. Now it doesn't necessarily need to be contrasting in the top, but I'm going to show you why I like to have a contrasting thread actually showing on the back of the quilt. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. So now after I have sewn the piping on the quilt, then I'm just going to clip this corner off, and we'll cut this off right on the edge. But before I sew the binding on, I do like to bring a ruler over and lay it on top. Let's get that here. I like to have that ruler come over. I'm lining up this ruler with the edge of the quilt, not the edge of the piping, and I'm just kind of cleaning up that corner, because what we want to make sure that we have is a nice 90-degree angle after we've sewn that piping on to the edge of the quilt. That's going to give us a really nice edge to be able to bind. Okay, so next, so we're going to just overlap each of those. You're going to sew it around the whole edge of the quilt. And so now when it comes to adding the binding to the quilt, if we made our binding, and if we just, I like to sew my binding on the front of the quilt and then wrap it around. So if we added our binding, we technically should be able to lay that binding right over the top, trust in our 1/4 inch seam allowance, and have that come out really nicely. But what I found is I was kind of freaking people out a little bit, saying to just cover it up and sew over the top of it. So this goes back to our contrasting thread in the bobbin when we sew the piping onto the front of the quilt. If I have a contrasting thread in that bobbin, I am still going to put my binding on the front of the quilt, matching up these raw edges. Now, I don't need to sew this on with the 1/4 inch piecing foot, but let me back up. We're going to put that binding on the front of the quilt, but we're going to turn it over and sew it on from the back of the quilt, just following the sew line that we sewed the piping on in the first place. Hopefully that makes sense to you. So what that means is I'm going to keep that binding on the front of the quilt. We're going to just follow the same line that we sewed the piping on in the first place. And here is one little thing that I love about sewing binding on this way, is that, let me just go to that point, do a little back stitch here. What I like about that is that when I sewed the binding onto the front of that quilt, it shows me exactly where that 1/4 inch away from the edge point is. So I know that that's where I'm going to start. And so then that is going to look fantastic. We have that nice accent of color on the edge of the quilt. Our quilt is really nice and stable and flat. I just want to point out that when you sew the binding on the front of the quilt, but from the back side, you're going to miter your binding around the quilt in a counterclockwise direction. Typically, we are doing that in a clockwise direction around the quilt. So, but it only feels weird for like 1 or 2 corners, and then you get really used to it. I just want to do one other quick thing about adding that binding to the quilt. When I do get ready, and this is with any quilt, not just when I have piping on the edge, but when I do get to this edge, or to this corner rather, and I'm ready to miter, I like to lay my quilt on top of a cutting mat, because then I know that when I fold my binding up here, I'm going to line the edge, the raw edge of the binding along a straight line. The edge of my quilt is along a straight line. So I know that I've got a nice 45-degree angle right here. Then we're going to fold this down. The other little binding tip that I have is you're making sure that these 2 folded edges are right together. And traditionally, most directions will say to have this fold be right along the edge of the quilt, but I like to bring it down just a thread or 2. Again, nothing that you can measure, but just a thread or 2 below the edge of that quilt. And what that helps is to prevent that little extra, little long mitered corner. So matching these up, matching that folded edge, and then you are going to make sure that's nice and straight, turn it over, and then just come back. I start at the very beginning, and we're going to just continue on sewing that binding on from the back side of the quilt, and then that just turns out awesome. We've got a nice piped accent, we've got a really nice mitered corner, and then we'll go on to some other binding techniques in other videos. But one other thing I wanted to show you that is kind of a nice addition to a quilt. I'm going to grab a project that's already done. It's kind of big. I'm just going to get a corner up here so you can see it. So if 1 layer of piping is great, then 2 layers of piping has got to be better, right? On this quilt, I've got 2 rows of piping, and then my binding. So I just want to show you real quick how we did that. We're going to follow the exact same process as we did before, but we're going to make a piping, and I've got this one already finished. And when we go to cut the seam allowance off with the piping tool, I am using, let's see where we can see it the best. I'm using the 3/8 inch mark. So I am making piping with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then I make my next piping with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to, let's do it this way as if I'm sewing it. I guess it's either way. So now I'm going to lay that piping with the 1/4 inch seam allowance right over the top, again matching up those raw edges. I like to sew them on separately, I don't like to try to do that at the same time. To me it's much more manageable. But you're going to do your 3/8 inch, sew that onto the edge of the quilt, make your piping with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but those right up next to each other. The nice thing is those raw edges match perfectly. Sew that on the edge of the quilt, and then you're just going to bind it just like you would normally do. And when I sew the binding on the quilt, just like I showed you, I follow the seam allowance for the 1/4 inch piping, not the 3/8 inch piping, if that makes sense. So the other quick tip is, after, let's say we have all of our piping sewn onto the edge of the quilt, maybe a corner isn't quite cleaned up, or maybe we have a little bit of extra quilt hanging out here on the edge. Before you sew the binding on the quilt, you can take the piping tool. This is my 1/4 inch. I'm going to just slide this back and forth, making sure that that cording is in the groove, and then I'm just going to clean up that edge. So the piping tool is used to give you that seam allowance, but you can also use it if you have sewn piping on the front of the quilt to kind of clean up that edge. So I hope this gives you a little inspiration and some fun ideas for really adding to the edges of your quilt, something that looks like you've done something hard, but it was actually really easy. And I'm so glad that you came today to Tensisters TV. Please like our video, and we welcome you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. In the description of the video, there's a link to our website, which is tensisters.com. And thanks for joining me today.